Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. It's great to see you, to have you all here for this launch by NPC of Building Blocks of Growth. It's a new report about tackling regional disparities and supporting local economic growth. Let me just first introduce myself. I've been involved in the advisory group to this project, delighted to have been, but I've also been through my think tank, Civil Exchange, been working over the last 12 years in this area. And I think it's just it's fantastic to see what this report is coming up with today. And I've also been involved in a network called A Better Way, which brings people together from across different sectors to look at how to improve services and strengthen communities. And I know that there are a lot of people out there who are doing this now with some fantastic examples. And this report too draws together some of that experience to really bring home the potential of civil society to make a difference. And levelling up perhaps has just faded a little bit politically with the demise of Boris Johnson, but actually it's still very much on the political radar, across the two main parties. And I think they're all committed to more devolution and to tackling regional disparities. The Levelling Up Fund has just been extended for a third round. And in the spring this year, the Chancellor announced the new Levelling Up partnerships in areas across the UK. Keir Starmer, his first pledge for the Labour Party is to get more growth, but he's also stressed as part of that commitment that good jobs and productivity growth should happen in every part of the country. So this is a very timely report, I think, for those sorts of policy discussions, as well as really helpful for people working on the ground who are trying to do this in local authorities and the public sector and civil society. Now, civil society always gets a lot of warm words, particularly after the COVID crisis. But I think that actually the thing that's really overlooked is its role in, economics, the economics of communities, helping to create good growth. And today we're discussing that role that charities and broader civil society can play in supporting local economic growth as part of the Levelling Up agenda, particularly in relation to education and health and building capital, social capital in the communities. We're going to hear from a great set of speakers. First of all, from Theo Clay about the report itself. Then from Alex Norris, who's the MP for Nottingham North, but also the Shadow Minister for Levelling Up. And then we'll be hearing from two people working more locally, Sultan Ali, a social prescriber and former councillor in Rochdale, and Pam Burniston, an area manager for the charity Porchlight, based in Thanet. Now, obviously, this is an on-the-record occasion. I believe we have at least one journalist present, so just bear that in mind when you're contributing. And also just do give us your questions. There will be an opportunity at the end of this event to talk with the panel about those questions. And do tweet. There's a hashtag Levelling Up. And so hopefully we'll be seeing a lively debate, not just from the speakers, but also from you. So I'm going to turn first to Theo, Theo Clay, who's been leading on this research and also leads on NPC's work on criminal justice. Theo, can you take us through the findings of this research?
Thanks, Caroline, and thanks everyone for joining us today. And thank you also to Lloyds Bank Foundation for England and Wales, who have supported us with this work. As Caroline says, I've lost count of the amount of pieces I've read over the past few months with the title, Is Levelling Up Dead? And with the fall of Boris Johnson, I think lots of people assumed that his flagship agenda would sink with him, but it hasn't quite been that way. And behind the scenes, the eponymous bill and the fund with the title, which shared by Levelling Up, are still moving. But bigger than this, as Caroline said, whoever's in government after the next election, the diagnosis of Britain's woes is the same, and that's regional inequalities. The symptoms are that people in communities around the country live shorter lives, have fewer opportunities, and are less happy than their peers born in a different postcode. There's even some alignment on the treatment, which seems to be devolution, although with some key differences on how quick and who's involved. But civil society has been somewhat lost in all of this. Although there were nice words in the Levelling Up white paper, in reality, this hasn't translated into much for the sector beyond some piecemeal project funding. Our analysis showed last year that as little as 2% of the Levelling Up money which had been allocated at that point has gone programs which could actually be delivered by charities. And worse, this picture may actually be going backwards, as I'll come to in a second. This is totally misguided, as civil society is an underestimated partner to economic growth. It's often considered a nice to have by policymakers. Charities, social enterprises, faith, and other community groups are best seen as playing an important but somewhat limited role in supporting social capital and community cohesion. Now, these things are crucial, and I would never want to play down the vital work that charities do in supporting communities and tackling social issues around the country. But these things and the other things that civil society does have a knock-on effect for economic outcomes, which are at the core of the Levelling Up agenda and which is often overlooked by policymakers. And that's what this work was trying to address. Now, I'm going to explain that by sharing a few slides. So there are three key value adds which civil society has over the state in supporting economic growth that we've identified through our work. Obviously, this doesn't cover everything that civil society does. It employs many people, for example, but we wanted to speak here about that special magic that civil society has, which makes it a unique and irreplaceable asset that government needs to think about and make use of when trying to tackle regional inequalities. The evidence here is incomplete, so we've tried to focus on where we think the evidence is strongest, and particularly around the links to education and health, as Caroline mentioned earlier on. Our hypothesis is that civil society has three unique value adds, and this is a simplified version of a diagram that we have in the report. Firstly, they prevent issues. By building social capital, the networks and relationships between people, civil society builds community resilience within places. This means that people have someone they can call on in a crisis, and a combination of people helping each other and also healthy levels of peer pressure means that outcomes like health and the determinants of it, education and well-being are improved in an area. And this in turn means that crisis points are averted when people would have to rely on emergency services instead. Secondly, they connect to people. Civil society has a unique ability to work with all parts of a community. Some people often have low trust with the state for a variety of very valid reasons, or are overlooked by marginalized by state services. Civil society has the ability to reach these people and support them with what they need. Finally, they can most effectively target inequalities in an area using a combination of their grassroots knowledge and lived experience insight to ensure services meet those who best require them. We hear a lot about how certain people can be invisible to statutory services, and this is obviously a very reductive way to put it, particularly because these people aren't invisible to the community around them. And civil society at its best is a formalization of the passion and care of that community and plays a vital role in ensuring those services reach the people who need it. What our evidence review has shown is that these things together can lead to tangible improvements in education and health outcomes in a community, which then have clear links to the productivity and wider outcomes of a local area. As when people aren't healthy or can't work, economies struggle to grow, as we've seen in the UK since the pandemic. So civil society organizations play a key role in supporting levelling up. However, our data analysis shows that civil society is currently weakest in the areas that it's actually needed most, and worse, that the gap might well be growing. We've looked at charity expenditure in local areas via the three different levelling up categories used in the Levelling Up Fund, and this organizes all local authorities into either category 1, 2, or 3, with 1 being the most in need areas and 3 being the least. we can see that there's a significant gap with category 1 and 2 areas having charity expenditure around a third lower than the wealthiest areas, category 3. This data uses Charity Commission data on location, which isn't perfect, but it shows a picture of the 75% of charities, local charities, struggling in exactly the areas that they're needed most. You can also see that even as expenditure broadly flatlines in category 3 areas, category 1 and 2 are dropping over the exact periods that levelling up is meant to be trying to close this gap. This is despite government's promises to use the levelling up missions as an anchor for policy across government and catalysing innovation by the civil society sector. So how do we try and solve this issue? Well, we invest in civil society to support in the areas that are needed most. We worked with civil society groups through this work and communities in 3 parts of the country, which are all category 1 levelling up areas. That's Thanet in Kent, Haywood in Rochdale, and Nottingham. And we're so grateful to everyone who gave their time to support us with this through workshops and one-to-one conversations. There's already great work going on around the country by charities and less formalized civil society groups. And through our work, we didn't want to take a top-down approach to designing interventions, so we spoke to charities and communities around the country to find out what their aspirations were for their area. Some of these models may sound new to you and others less so, but the idea wasn't to recreate the wheel, but was instead to try and build on strengths that are already there and our understanding of the 3 unique advantages we mentioned earlier to support economic growth. 2 are new ideas. We worked with groups to come up with in Nottingham and Thanet, and one's an existing intervention in Haywood, which we're shining a light on. So starting off with that one, in Haywood, an existing network of voluntary sector and health professionals came together during the pandemic to improve health and well-being in an area which faces loneliness and health inequality issues. The Haywood with a Heart network prevents health issues by building connections between charities, statutory services, and the local community. It uses local intelligence to target interventions in the right places and engage all parts of the community, and in doing so aims to help the people in Haywood better manage health conditions, reduce loneliness, improve well-being and independence for those involved. In Thanet, a proposed lived experience link worker service would allow people with lived experience of migration to act as link workers to build connections with migrant and refugee communities, offering support to improve well-being and prevent health problems over the long term. By embedding someone within the health system to support people into the services they need, this service aims to improve the health of the community in Thanet, improve their well-being, support them to better manage the conditions that they have, and undertake paid work if they want to. Finally, in Nottingham, through mapping early years needs and services data, we can improve school readiness and prevent poor outcomes for children. So when we spoke to practitioners, they had concerns that school readiness for children beginning education had declined since the pandemic, and better understanding of where the gap between needs and services were would better allow the voluntary sector and local authorities to offer support for those who need it in the area. You can read more about all of these in the paper, and I'd really encourage you to do so, as well as look at the suggestions for where else these types of ideas could apply. So these 3 ideas show how civil society can use their unique advantages to support the building blocks of economic growth in the area. And we really urge people to support and scale initiatives like these, as well as other efforts to engage civil society organizations and communities to develop ideas in other areas. But alone, however, these won't be enough to tackle the inequalities we see nationwide. We need a new approach to tackling inequalities, and we've suggested 2 parallel steps to do this. The first is social investment zones, 12 of them in parallel to the levelling up investment zones announced by government. These should include new central government funding, partnerships with local grant givers, as well as long-term funding and incentives to encourage more funding into the area. And the second is a new national framework to tackle inequalities across the UK and not just in these communities. This also needs to include weighting central government grants to local authorities to consider deprivation, as well as new funding to support education, health, and the wider determinants, new powers devolved to communities and local authorities, and better measurement capacities to work out what works. Only through taking a similarly ambitious approach will we seriously be able to tackle the inequalities at the heart of levelling up and leverage civil society as an essential partner within it. That's my time. So thanks very much. And I look forward to discussing more in the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Theo. That was really, really interesting. So I'm now going to ask Alex Norris to give his reflections on this. And as I said earlier, he's the Shadow Minister for Levelling Up. He's also a Labour MP, Labour and Cooperative MP for Nottingham North, which he's been since 2017. And he brings not just experience of Westminster here, but he was himself a Nottingham City Councillor, holding responsibility for adults and health, and has also worked as a trade union organiser. So I think he sees it from a number of perspectives. And I'm sure we're all fascinated to hear what you've got to say, Alex.
Thanks, Caroline, and thanks to Theo and MPC as well for the kind invite and for all the work that's gone into this. I think the document makes a great read and is a really good place for us to discuss. And I'm really, so delighted there's so many people, and just as people were putting the names up, like where they're from and what they do, what a wonderful range. That gave me real joy, both geographic and in roles. I can't help but think that collectively we must be able to solve a lot of our trickiest challenges with that collective kind of heft and experience that we've got. Certainly, Caroline, as you kindly said, I'm Alex Norris. I'm the Shadow Levelling Up Minister, and I'm a Labour and Cooperative MP. And today's not a day for party politics, but Selina's here, even better. We've got. I knew I'd have some Nottingham company. The reason I mentioned Labour and Cooperative, because Labour's who I am, but cooperative is what I do. I believe really strongly that the services and the things that shape people's lives, they should have a stake and a say in what happens for those services and those opportunities. I also believe that cooperatives or community businesses, whatever you call it, I'm not kind of doctrinal about it, are more resilient. They keep money and power within the communities that they operate in. And we also know that they're more diverse and reflect the communities that they serve, which is why I think that model is such an important one. And it won't surprise you, therefore, to hear from me that I think that civil society is at the heart of Levelling Up, or it ought to be, and perhaps as the report identifies, it isn't at the moment. Levelling Up still exists, whatever your political hue, the idea that children born today, the biggest predeterminant of their lives will be their postcode, and that for communities all over the Zoom call, young people or people generally will feel they have to leave to access opportunities. Well, I think that those are things that we ought to want to tackle as a country, as a collective of people together on a call, and of course for our government to prioritise. So Levelling Up is very real. I want to see a shift of emphasis so that Levelling Up becomes less about things and more about people. And I think that was a theme that ran throughout the report. And we have to start by saying, as the report says, that civil society is underused in this space. And I've got some ideas about how we might address that. But I thought particularly that those three things identified, we know we lack prevention in our communities. It's so frustrating to see all these late and expensive and ineffective interventions that we don't, because we haven't made those earlier interventions. We know that our services are disconnected. And again, for me as a constituency MP and previously as a councillor, trying to help people navigate a system that is doing its best, but it's so disjointed. And Selina, Bulwell Toy Library, do an incredible job of helping people there, but it's too hard, and we need to do better at connecting it. And we know that we haven't got a firm enough focus on the inequalities that hold us all back as a country. It's terrible for communities like mine that are on the sharp end of it, but actually those inequalities are bad for all of us as a country and don't serve any of us. So, those I think are really important identifications in the report, but crucially, the confidence, Theo, with which the report states that civil society are best placed to resolve many of those issues. I think we should carry that confidence. I think that's true. And also that really profound and important reflection that actually for communities that most need civil society interventions, often we're the less well placed. And again, so that calls on us, I think, as decision makers to do something a little bit different. Now, Caroline, you said, and I completely agreed, that the devolution is very much the heart of Levelling Up. And I agree with that. And of course, that is about this move of power from Whitehall to Town Hall, shifting important decisions to our nation's regions and sub-regions, because we have confidence in that those local communities will deliver better. I say this in full, I'm about to say in full humility, but never trust a politician when they're saying how humble they're being. But putting that to one side, you know, I feel I'm an expert by experience in Nottingham, and I have a pretty strong sense with my Nottingham colleagues about what we need as a community. I know that someone's popped up, someone from Wallsend is with us today. Now, I know a little bit about Wallsend. My wife's from just down the road. You know, I have some sense, but if I wanted to get answers about what Wallsend needed, I would talk to you first. I would talk to your colleagues. I would talk to your citizens. Now, I hope it won't surprise you. I hope to be levelling up minister after the next general election. The act of me crossing the threshold into the department would not suddenly give me omniscience about Wallsend. I would know pretty much as I did the day before. So I don't believe that my role as minister then is to go in and be the centralising, benevolent decision maker for all those communities. Actually, I see the role is to try and shift power so that those who do have that expertise have the money and the power locally to make that change. And I think that's a significant change in the way in which we could operate this country. We have moved, and I want to recognise that we've moved positively in this space in recent years, but we have to do more, and we have to get everybody into that settlement. But I'll say this, and this is hugely important, that if what people get from levelling up, from devolution, from trying to address that desire to take back control, whatever you think about the 2014 Scottish independent referendum, 2016 Brexit referendum, whatever you think about the online conversation and the quality of that, you know, and the frustration people have with politics, all of that reflects a desire to take back control of their lives and their communities. If what people get for that is only a shift of power from the centre to probably a novel organisation, a combined authority that's further away than their local authority is, that will not have done it. It will be good in itself and it will lead to better decision making. However, we need double devolution, and that is absent at the moment from the conversation. And I'm trying to put that back into it. And this report is an important part of that, that says, okay, well, where are the community in this? Where is civil society? And we have already staked out, as you will have seen, Lisa, my boss, the Shadow Secretary of State, Lisa set out our community right to buy, which is building out from the community right to bid so that those beloved local buildings or things in communities are not lost. I also want to see, and we will be coming forward with ideas around the community being more involved in service delivery of the local services that matter to them. And I know we've got colleagues from Power to Change on the call who may have reflections on that at some point as well. I'm really excited by the work that we've seen in community ownership hubs in South Yorkshire. So trying to give, you know, through that mayoral combined authority, people different ways of setting up community enterprise. I think there's a lot in that. We could see more of that. So I want to see those community rights and opportunities to be out there for everybody so that they can really take back control of things that happen in their communities. I think there's great desire for it. And I also believe, and you know, the report highlights this, that we can be confident in how effective that can be done. But it is also crucial in that we don't lose this fact that it is harder in communities where people are pressed for time, that perhaps, you know, you don't have that mix of skills on an estate of an accountant, a PR person, a finance person, you know, whatever it is, that actually we make other interventions, and the report mentions ways in which that could be done to make sure those communities have the assets to get the best out of those new rights and responsibilities. I mean, the challenge I would put to Theo and to colleagues on the call more generally is, how do you find that balance? I wrestle with this every day, and I will finish, Caroline, on this point. How do you find that balance between national prescription, because we want to have that sense that, you know, everybody has access to these opportunities, and investment zones were one of the ideas, and a national framework was another, but in a way that reflects that we believe that locally, the local leadership will deliver this better than centralisation. I believe that as strongly as I believe anything, and we have to find that balance. You know, my instinct is to defer to devolving the responsibilities and the resources to local communities and letting them choose the model that they go for. But I'm interested to try and provoke some input on that point as well as anything else I said. So thanks very much for having me. Really enjoyed the report and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thanks so much for that, Alex. That's fantastic, and really great to hear that commitment to double devolution, because I think that is really critical. And also, you know, refreshing to hear politicians saying that they don't know the answers. They need to talk to local people. That's really, really great. So I'm now going to turn to two people who've different ways been doing this locally, and they're going to tell us about their reflections and insights. The first is Sultan Ali, who came to this country from Pakistan in 1966, I believe, and is a local councillor in Rochdale, but is also working as a social prescriber. So I think he really knows what he's talking about, but he's also interestingly worked in the public sector, in Inland Revenue and in the probation service. So he's got a lot of multi-sectoral insights to bring to this. So over to you, Sultan. Where are you, Sultan? You need to put your camera on, and quite sure where Sultan is. So maybe we should go to Pam and we'll come back to Sultan. How about that? So Pam, over to you. Pam is the area manager in Thanet for Porchlight, a charity that works with people with mental health challenges. And she's also been telling me that to help with her own mental health, she's also regularly walked by her two bulldogs on the beaches and in the woods of Thanet. Which is, I don't know if they're in the background there, Pam, but we may be hearing from them as you speak.
Yes, honestly, we may. So apologies if that happens. Also, apologies, I'm slightly under the weather. So if I do have to break to cough, I'm very sorry about that. So thank you to Caroline, and thank you to Theo and the team for inviting me here to talk. I was one of the participants in some of the group work in the Thanet area, and I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about kind of Porchlight, my organisation Porchlight, and the role we play in civil society in East Kent and Thanet, and some reflections on what we've heard today and I've read about in the report. So I grew up in East Kent in the 80s. When Margate, which is one of the coastal towns in Thanet, was really the coastal town that forgot to close down for the summer. So, sorry, I hope no one objects to me quoting Morrissey. It's always seemed apt in the journey of East Kent. I have to say that now in the 2020s, Margate is nothing could be further from the truth. We've now been compared to Marbella as being a desirable place to visit and live, and regeneration and sort of levelling up is discussed here as being often a great thing. And we live apparently in a desirable up and coming area, but the reality of this is often that actually the inequality is being compounded. The division in our communities between those that have and those that have not is worsening. There is some optimism here, and I will get to that. So some context, I work for Porchlight, and I've worked here for a very long time, working in Thanet for a majority of that time. If I tell you that our vision is to strive for a fairer society where vulnerable people find stability, the most excluded are included, and where homelessness and poverty is a thing of the past, you may understand a bit more about why modern Margate as a tourism area is a concern for me. Porchlight was founded in the 1970s by a man who'd been who had experienced as homelessness himself, to provide solutions for others, which we still do. We still do a lot of that, and the highlighting of health inequalities for the homelessness population is something we do very vocally. However, we also do a lot more. Our mission is about changing lives for the better by preventing people from becoming homeless through the provision of timely support, personalised support services. We provide housing, education, employability, and personal development support to vulnerable and isolated people in our communities. And we challenge negative attitudes towards people who are homeless or living with mental health illness or living in poverty. We pride ourselves on very much being part of the local community. We listen to the people around us, and one of the best parts of my job is working as part of a lived experience panel influencing the work that we do. And we work hard to ensure that we're providing services that meet local needs. My role as an area manager in our mental health directorate is as a role. And I live in my community as well as working here. So I love the place I work and the impact that my work has on that community. I'm quite biased, but we are a really positive example of how civil society can work well. My area of work focuses on delivery of the Liverpool Kent and Medway network. This is a commission service with the challenges and opportunities that brings, where funding from Kent County Council and our local integrated home care board is allocated to us as a strategic partner to help create a network of delivery partners aimed at providing community-focused support across Kent to reduce mental health inequalities. To do this, we work with other civil society providers who may be challenged when looking at competing on a wider stage for these contracts. Our aim is to help develop smaller organisations to build the resilience and support and provide a support structure while providing the best support for the community. So what we do, the offer that we have in Margate looks really different to Dover, Romney, Marshall, Tunbridge Wells. The advantage for this as an organisation is great. We've been able to learn from our partners. We've been able to build evidence for kind of encouraging extra support within the Thanet area. And we've been able to kind of make sure there's a strong sense of quality across all the services, whilst working with the community to remain relevant to their needs. For us, the recommendation in the report is excellence. The migrant community is something that with our limited resources we've not been able to further tap into and would really like to work alongside the evolving plans. The improved relationship of working in partnership has enabled better engagement in communities. People who are being supported are able to travel through their support journey confident that we're working together for their benefit. People do not have to keep retelling their stories, and our offer is personalised to meet their needs, and we offer support where people need it. So, and we do this through a combination of working in a one-to-one fashion, working with peers, and through groups and other activities. The knock-on of our experience over the years in Live Well Kent is that we've been able to build on our funded network to provide a more cohesive support landscape with increased communication and involvement with GP practices and community mental health teams, generally improving access across the Thanet area. Also using our position to highlight gaps where they exist. We often refer to Live Well Kent and Medway as a safety net, preventing people from reaching crisis point, educating and enabling better decision making, and hopefully increasing quality of life. So this kind of is an example of what Theo was talking about as kind of good practice. However, we're talking about a relatively small mental health provision in a world where post-COVID anxiety rates are increasing, and we're in a cost of living crisis, with an area where housing is being taken up into Airbnbs, the demand is growing on us, and we're constantly needing to see what we can do differently and do more. However, I'm optimistic because organisations exist that want to work together. And in Thanet, in Margate particularly, there is a passion to see how we can work together to adapt to this ever-changing world and to look at the needs, very much as reflected in the recommendations we're reading today, we've been hearing about today. I think in general terms about the Thanet community, only to be reminded that 46 languages spoken in a 2-mile square, and that Margate has its own particular sets of issues. There's a commonly quoted statistic that one side of Tesco's on North Down Road, your life expectancy is a decade longer than the other. So we know there are inequalities in our own community. I'm particularly interested in looking hyper-locally in the future at kind of the changing nature of our population and how the new DFL population is could help develop and improve the lives of the older Phoenician community and vice versa. And I think the recommendations made by Theo and the team really would help with the ability to do some of that. I think us being able to locally lead the work that we're looking at in the future would be a really positive way forward. So, as I said, I'm optimistic. I really hope I would be really interested to see how the recommendations talked about here today are taken forward, and I'm more than happy to share any information about our work, so feel free to ask us questions in the section, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Pam. That's really brought home how connected voluntary organisations can be in their community, and it's great to hear that people really are working across different services and sectors. They really want to work together, and it really can make a difference. We've got some technical problems, I think, it's fair to say, with Sultan. I don't know whether whether he's able to join us now. Let's have a look. Let's see if he can. Otherwise, I think probably we should go to questions and maybe come back to him if we can connect with him at a later point. We do have a fantastic group of people. I don't know if you've been looking at the chat bar, but there's a really great group of people on this webinar, and do keep your questions coming. But I have picked up a few of them. Let me just see if I can due to the magic of yes. So well, this is an interesting one, really. How embedded is this kind of thinking? I think questions specifically about DCMS, but I think it's an interesting question to put to Steve as well, because you were saying earlier that sorry, to Alex, you were saying earlier that this is the right thing to do, but it isn't sort of the mainstream at the moment. How can we make it more mainstream in the thinking of politicians? How can we reach out to you? Obviously, it's fantastic you're here, and we know that you've got it. You get the message. But how can we do to make this a more to make a higher awareness of the potential here? Alex.
Thank you, Caroline. I mean, it isn't the norm, and we'll leave the kind of past and the analysis of why we are where we are probably for people to make their own minds up. But the question about what we do, I think, should act as a call to action, because this is now, without kind of peeling back the curtain on the lives of political parties, but it doesn't take much, you don't need to be pestant to work out that we've got a general election coming at some point between now and presumably the end of next year. So at the moment, all political parties are making their plans, and certainly for us, we are in the real sharp end of our policy making process. So if you look across the collective heft of the national organisations, I see a lot of my friends, Power to Change, Locality, Local Trusts, all of whom are highly effective advocates to people like me and my opposite numbers in the other parties. So I think the challenge for the big organisations, MPC of course as well, is having that really consistent ask between those different organisations that are engaging with ministers and shadow ministers. We've been really laser focused on what you're asking for, and then for the rest of you, the one thing I know for certain, again, this knows no political hue, is that your local MP and councillors, whoever they are, of what political party or non, will want to engage with you, and I'm sure already are in some degree. Use that relationship now to say, look, this is what we want, because I can promise you that local intervention is very, very persuasive. So, as I say, there is something for us to do as decision makers in changing the status quo, but I hope that it acts as a call to action for those who care about this too, to really push us and to make sure that in a world where there's always lots and lots of things going on, your organisations are clear that this is a priority to you and your community.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because, is there a consistent message, that's coming from the sector? I hope this report will really help to embed the idea that actually the voluntary sector and civil society can help with growth. They can do lots of great things, from prevention, as the report says, and so forth, but also, all of that adds up to inclusive growth and greater equality. But Theo, another question that we've had is, how are you going to take this forward? What are your next plans on this report? Because there's some really great ideas for pilots, and but what are you going to do to put this into the mainstream of the agenda?
Yeah, no, it is a really good question, Caroline. And I think that it's definitely fair to say that the work doesn't end here. If anything, I think it starts here. I think that we've, got a lot of work now to do on trying to kind of advocate and speak up on behalf of these ideas. Firstly, I guess to both parties, and it's great that Alex was able to join us here today. But I think that there's a lot of work. There's some momentum here from both parties in slightly different ways in trying to think about this agenda, and particularly on the devolution question. So I think there's something that we're going to be doing about trying to shape that and trying to talk about the role of civil society within that. I think secondly, talking to officials is really important, and we've got a lot of work to try and think about practically how these types of ideas work and how we can try and develop ways and build on the recommendations that I flagged up at the end. And I think crucially, and perhaps most importantly, trying to advocate for these ideas in local areas. I talked about those three ideas in Thanet, Hayward, and Nottingham. And I think that these are all three really important ideas which warrant further investment. But I think similarly, trying to encourage an approach which leads from a kind of a bottom up and tries to take the best understanding of communities and civil society. That's the type of approach that we need to embed in communities and local authorities all around the country. And as Alex says, this needs to kind of grow from devolution and from the communities who know the issues best. So there's a lot of work for us to do in taking this forward. And yeah, definitely all starts here in earnest.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking at a few more questions here, but I'm just also wondering whether Sultan is able to join us now. No camera, he's on mute. I suspect he's still got those technical problems. So, one of the questions that sort of caught my eye is how do you do listening well? Alex talked about listening, but also, there's a kind of tendency, another person has pointed this out, there's a tendency to talk a good talk about devolution, but when you get into power, Alex, I'm sure this won't be true of you, but when you get into power, you just love that, you just like announcing things and doing things, nationally. I mean, I certainly, we've seen quite a lot of that over the years. And I wanted to sort of really turn to Pam, to kind of give some reflections on this, because it's quite easy when you're working on the ground to sort of feel like you're the bottom of the pile, and the local authorities or devolved administrations where they exist can feel a very long way away. So what's the secret of good listening? When do you feel listened to, and what does that look like when you're talking to politicians?
Yes, what's the secret of good listening? I think it depends. I think some politicians listen better than others, and I think hence for us is a particularly challenging area because there is such a lot of need, and it is about the voices being heard loudest, I think. I think for us, we focus on listening to our community, and that's what helps being a very local organisation. And we have a very good CEO and a very good comms team who work on getting that message out further. But if we're always learning and always trying to develop, because I think it is one of the challenges of organisations such as ours, is how do you adequately get your voice heard while working within the parameters of kind of contracts of your contracts of funding, without kinds of marginalising other people doing the similar thing in the community. It's always going to be a slight area of conflict for us until we're at a level of playing field where we're not being forced to compete against each other for similar pots of money. I think for us, definitely strength of the more people involved in the conversation, so strength in numbers really, really helps. But that it can be challenging when you're constantly in competition with the people that actually you want to be promoting. So yeah, a different landscape would help us a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, this thing about competition between charities and other organizations in civil society, but that joining forces, really joining up and speaking with one voice is very important. I noticed in the chat bar that there's a great link. I think it's from Beth Sharratt, In Greater Manchester, we've done lots of work on helping policymakers understand the current and potential economic impact of the voluntary sector, and also demystifying economic policy for the voluntary sector themselves. And there's some blogs you can look to, so that I think is worth considering. Now, another question that's got my eye, lots of them coming in, is how would you ensure that social investment zones don't contribute to the fragmented and competitive levelling up funding picture as it exists now? I'm going to turn to Thea, but I also want to kind of add a little question of my own, which is something quite dear to my heart actually, which is how do you get more money into local areas? Because the report says quite a lot about that. Working with community development foundations. I'm aware of a really great example of Bristol, actually, where they have Bristol and City Funds, where the community development foundation is involved and some government money has come in. So yeah, what we have at the moment, it's just so easy to do, isn't it? Ministers announcing that and this, and then you get all these different initiatives, and then you're on the ground, and you're so busy you haven't got time to kind of apply or engage. So how are we going to make this work, Theo?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. So I'll take that second one first, around kind of getting the extra funding in. I think one of the interesting examples we were looking at in the work was Labour's New Deal for Communities, which I think is kind of quite widely accepted as a very effective programme to try and turn around communities and support them with their aspirations. But one of the kind of the flaws with that programme was that there wasn't really as much impact in trying to kind of sustain a legacy of them beyond. And I think part of that was that there was significant amounts of kind of government funding given, but there was fewer efforts to try and involve other actors, the private sector, and kind of independent funding and grant makers. And so I think that one thing that would be really vital in ensuring that these types of any kind of future attempts have more of a legacy is efforts to try and catalyze and use make sure that other funding comes in. And I think there's a bunch of different ways that you can think about that. We at MPC have done a lot of work on blended finance, which is a route to try and kind of leverage in private sector funding with some kind of matched funding from government to try and support civil society initiatives. I think similarly, you can think about using gift aid and things like that in clever ways to encourage local philanthropy. And there's ideas that have been put forward by people like Pro Bono Economics around local philanthropy champions, which we support in the report for trying to encourage other people. And then there's a lot of other kind of cultural things as well you can do. So I think there's a whole bunch of different ways. But again, and I think coming back to the kind of initial question around the competitive funding pots, I think both of this needs to come from what best suits the local area and be kind of led by local leaders, local civil society organizations. And it's only through kind of giving the power for them to decide the agenda that best suits that area that we can kind of really overcome that kind of competitive nature of it. Of the existing levelling up funds, and by kind of handing the money to decide how to distribute in a way that best suits the needs of those areas and involve extra funding that best suits the needs of the area as well.
Lovely. Now I've got a question here. Has rural UK been considered in regards to tackling regional inequality? It's a question for Theo, but actually I'd also quite like to ask Alex about rural inequalities, and because one of the issues with the sort of devolution of gender, great as it is it doesn't necessarily work so well in rural areas, though there are devolved settlements, aren't there, for some rural areas, or at least quite wide areas. So can I go to Alex first, and I'll come to you, Theo?
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. I think we have to start with the recognition that levelling up should not be a north versus south, London versus the rest of the UK, town versus rural. Those sort of false dichotomies don't serve us. We need to recognise that we see poverty in almost every community. London has some of the most really profound social challenges, as well as obviously some of the best of the country as well. But that's that we feel that in rural communities, coastal communities, both of which I think are a bit left out of the conversation, that actually the nature of their challenges just are different. And for rural, but for accessing, say employment support, well, if you haven't got broadband, at all, never mind, access to it, never mind finance to access it, well, that's a really big problem. Similarly, if you're an oil powered house, then what your experience of recent pressures is different to my experience of it. If your access to public transport is existential for your ability to access work and training and all that. So I think we do have to understand that. Again, I would make that as an argument for for that local leadership, because who knows that better and how that manifests than those local leaders. And part of the challenge so far is that mayors started, if we remember, as metro mayors, and so now what we've got is big conurbations, some of which have rural communities, but largely don't. But that means that 40% of England are in the settlement, 60% aren't. So we have to address that if we're going to get those, those local powers, say, to regulate bus services, to make sure that rural towns or hamlets aren't left out. So I think a lot to get at there. But as I say, at the moment it's not really being spoken about very much. So I think it's very good that we put it in the conversation today.
Theo, do you want to add anything on that? And I might actually ask Pam about this, because I think Pam is working in a coastal area. So, but Theo first.
Yeah, I'd love to hear Pam's reflections as well, because I think yeah, you're right, it is very different in different areas. I think that what's interesting when you look at the kind of the makeup of civil society coverage and expenditure in rural versus urban areas is that just how distinct the issues are, and how different the coverage of civil society organizations is. That in urban areas, in the areas of deep deprivation, there might well be quite a few civil society organizations working that's based there, when we know that cities have kind of clusters of charities who can support people with different needs. Whilst in rural areas with high levels of deprivation, those same types of organizations, particularly social welfare focused organizations, might be more absent, and there might be other types of civil society action going on, but less focused on the kind of deep levels of poverty and the social issues which they're meant to tackle. And so I think that some of the work that I'd flag up here is the work of community foundations and the role that they can play in trying to coordinate the action that's going on, and make sure that's best targeting the needs. Because yeah, as you say, in rural areas, it's much easier for people to be overlooked by the services that do exist.
Yeah, so Pam, interesting to get your reflections on this, and linking with it another question which was directed at you, which is, how do you get the money to the right place? And also another question related to that, how do you work with neighbourhoods to make sure that you actually know where the right places are? The money sort of trickles down, but how can we make sure that not just that things are tailored to the issues that you're facing, but also that you can do your best to make sure that the real problems that are being addressed, get the funding that they need.
Largely, it's a big challenge. I think the nature of Kent and Thanet as well is that we have very built up urban areas, and then we have very rural communities that previously would have been based on agriculture, and quite a while ago now mining. So we do experience the challenges of trying to engage people in those communities. It's much harder to offer kind of support groups and activities in a community when you may be experiencing kind of paranoia or anxiety about being judged by your neighbours. So we fully experience kind of the additional challenges. We also kind of see higher unemployment, and an increase in stable housing in kind of these communities. I think we take a very person-centered approach, so everyone's support package would look different, and it's not necessarily, it's for us, it's our way of working. We will take our support to where people need it and kind of work with them on that basis. But when it comes to designing services, particularly to do that, it is a challenge. And what we see is some very strong local, very small organisations, often that are focused around one or two people, that don't necessarily get the stability of an organisation of, say, the size of Porchlight. which comes down to, which does bring us to how do we focus on getting money to the right place. The funding I receive from the local authority, the funding we receive, is very much based on targeting deprivation, and so focused on deprivation areas. A lot of our rural areas aren't necessarily considered to be deprived because they're actually quite wealthy, if taken on an overview. So we are very creative and engage and do what we can to kind of meet the needs of the people presenting to us. And that does mean that we work with local community partners to do things really well. It's a bit of a woolly answer, I'm really sorry about that, but it's a challenge that we're always considering. I think in terms of homelessness, it's something there's a lot of research going into at the moment, because it is a new and a kind of emerging area where homelessness is quite high. It's also an area where we have to work with a lot of partners to do it because of the different communities that we see, such as Gypsy and Roma traveller groups within this community that maybe we don't have the expertise to manage in our own services. So it's a great scope for partnership working. And I think Sultan is joining us. Sorry.
No, well, I'm hearing sounds, Sultan. I can't see you. Are you?
Just switching on the
brilliant.
video. It's been. This is where deprivation comes in. IT deprivation. Sorry about this.
IT deprivation. If you haven't got the broadband, I think Alex made that point earlier on, actually. I'm so sorry about the troubles that you've been having there, Sultan. We've just got a few minutes left, and we might just give you, the last word.
Yes, sure.
So I've already introduced you to the audience, but just to remind people that you're working in Rochdale, you're a local councillor and also a social prescriber. I mean, I don't know what you've been able to hear of the discussion so far, but tell us a little bit about what you're doing. We've only got a couple of minutes, but it'd be great to hear from you.
Sure, thank you very much, and many apologies, colleagues, for this. I've been trying, Theo's been trying, his colleagues have been trying to get me connected up, but apologies. Yes, I've heard most of the event. It's very, very interesting, and I'm honoured and privileged to have been part of it, be it non-visual. I feel that there's an awful lot that I wanted to say, and IT's just ruffled me up no end, and apologies for that. Yes, I've my frame, which is 4 foot 10.5 inches, oozes deprivation, and I live in deprivation, etc. Despite my career having been classed as middle class, I certainly don't feel middle class, and I think the civil society has a role to play, and it shouldn't be seen the people that it interacts with as usual suspects by the powers to be, because I think the local knowledge, you cannot put a value on it because you live, breathe and sleep with your environment and your neighbourhoods. Rochdale, which I affectionately refer to as the centre of the universe, is a fantastic place and a lot of history and a lot to offer. But within that, there are pockets and large areas which have not been seen the best of the levelling up, funding or the input. So I think the 3 principles that civil society have outlined of preventing, connecting and targeting, only local people can actually provide that vision and the information to try and address the inequalities. As a social prescribing link worker, which I only joined in October last year after having retired from my full-time occupation. By the way, Chair, I'm no longer a local councillor because I made way, and this could be another factor about civil society. I stepped down from a safe street seat in favour of a woman because we wanted to increase female numbers on the council. So that has another factor, and the woman came from or comes from an area which suffers a lot of inequalities. So I really do feel that unless we get our act together, my sort of model for regeneration, and particularly regeneration, which is very, very expensive, I understand that, is start from the centre, but not at the expense of the pockets of deprivation. Hayward and Middleton would say from the outset that, you know, Rochdale, which is a bigger township, gets all the funding, etc., and Hayward and Middleton gets overlooked. Obviously, I've been in Rochdale since 1970. And in Britain, 57 years of my 67 years I've been in Britain. So I've seen it all, experienced it all, racism and everything else that goes with it, disabilities and how things have changed. I'm pleased to say that it's not all been doom and gloom. There's some positives in there as well. However, to keep up the momentum of regeneration and addressing inequalities, we really do need to home in on some of the ideas that civil society can have highlighted and included. It's been a refreshing read, a very, very informative report, Theo. Thank you very much to you and your colleagues. And it's revitalized and enthused me to try and get on the address and not be bogged down. And because, you know, these topical issues are like fashion, they come and go, but the people who are suffering remain in the rut. And I'm given a historical perspective, I still subscribe to the North Watford gap. The North-South divide still does exist. And, you know, I don't know how or when this will get addressed, but local people have the agenda, and there are an awful lot of people, and I use the term, there are a lot of damaged people out there. And when you look at health and education, those two things alone would actually bring about an awful lot of well-being if they were addressed. I mean, the most complaint I receive as a social prescriber is that I can't get an appointment with my GP or any GP. And then we have the emerging communities, new arrivals to the country who've got additional barriers of language, culture, and discrimination. So there is an awful lot to address.
Can I just interrupt? Sorry, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but we have reached, you know, we've run out of time. But I want to congratulate you on a fantastic last word. You've really illustrated the challenge and the opportunity. And I'd like to thank all of our speakers. I'm not sure if Alex is still with us, but you know, Pam and Theo. And can I just ask you to fill out a feedback survey, which I believe is available. It should be in the chat bar. Read the report, retweet, and add your voice to the recommendations from NPC. It's a really good report, but I think we've got a very strong message coming out of this, which we need to speak more consistently, and we need to join forces to really get this message across. But it's good to hear, you know, it's good to hear that Alex is really listening and believes in listening. And you know, there's an opportunity here with the political changes, you know, the kind of levelling up agenda with this government, potentially other governments in future, we shall see. Lovely to see you all. Thank you so much for taking part, and thank you for your great comments in the chat bar and questions, and hope to see you soon. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline, and thanks everyone for joining us.